I'm sorry, Kyla. That wasn't fair of me. Sometimes I still use the wits God gave me in dishonorable ways. I'm trying to do what's right, whether or not that measures up to what men call honorable. There is a gap between those, you know.
Kyla shrugged, but no answer was required.
I'm not interested in condemning my baby girl, Kyla. I've done far worse in my life than she'll ever dream of. But more than her happiness is at stake. Is Logan aware of her indiscretions?
I asked her to tell him, but I don't believe she has, sir.
You know that Logan has asked for my permission to marry Sarah.
Yes, sir.
Should I give him my blessing?
You couldn't hope to gain a better son.
For my family it would be wonderful. But is that right for Logan?
I think he loves her.
He wants to know within 2 days. When he turns 21, he takes possession of the Gaia household and becomes one of the richest and most powerful men in the realm, even given how the king has interfered with his house in the last decade. 6th in the line of succession, 1st behind the royals. Now, people will say that he's marrying beneath himself. They'll say she isn't worthy of him. I don't usually give a damn what they think, Kyla, because they think it for all the wrong reasons. But this time, I'm afraid they'll be right.
Kyla couldn't say anything.
I've prayed for years that my daughters would find the right men to be their husbands. And I've prayed that Logan would marry the right woman. Why doesn't this feel like the answer? Forgive me. I've asked you a dozen questions you can't possibly answer, and I haven't asked you the one you can.
What's that, sir?
Do you love Sarah?
No, sir.
And that girl? The one you've been sending money to for almost a decade?
I've sworn not to love, sir.
But do you?
Kyla walked out the door.
You know, I pray for you too, Kyla.
The whorehouse had closed hours ago. Upstairs, the girls slept on fouled sheets amid the brothel smells of stale alcohol, stale sweat, old sex, wood smoke, and cheap perfume. The doors were locked. All but 2 of the plain copper lamps downstairs had been extinguished. Mama Kay didn't allow her brothels to waste money. There were only 2 people downstairs, both of them at the bar. Around the man's seat were the remains of a dozen smashed glasses. He finished the 13th beer, lifted the glass, and threw it onto the floor. Mama Kay poured Durzo another beer from the tap, not even blinking. She didn't say a word. Durzo would speak when he was ready. Still, she wondered why he'd chosen this brothel. It was a hole. She sent her attractive girls elsewhere. Other brothels she'd bought had been worth fixing, but this one huddled deep in the Warrens, far from main roads and the maze of shacks and hovels. This was where she'd lost her maidenhead. She'd been paid 10 silvers and had counted herself lucky. It wasn't high on her list of places to visit.
I should kill you.
They were the first words he'd spoken in 6 hours.
Oh, so you do have the power of speech.
Mama Kay grabbed another glass and opened the tap.
Do I have a daughter, too?
Mama Kay froze.
Vonda made me swear not to tell you. She was too scared to tell you, and then when she died... You can hate Vonda for what she did, Durzo, but she did it because she loved you.
What do you know about love, you whore?
She had thought that no one could hurt her with words. She'd heard every whore comment in the book and had added a few besides. But something in how Durzo said it, something about that comment, coming from him, struck her to the core.
I know if I'd had the chance for love that you had, I would have quit whoring. I would have done anything to hold on to that. I was born into this chamber part of a life. You're the one who chose it.
What's my daughter's name?
So that's it? You bring me here to remind me how many times I got fucked in this stinking hole? I remember. I whored so my baby sister wouldn't have to. And then you came along. You fucked me 5 times a week and told Vonda you loved her. Got her pregnant. Left. I could have told her that much was a given. That part of the story's so predictable it's not even worth repeating, is it? But you weren't just any John, no. No, you got her kidnapped too. And then what? Did you go after her? No. No, you showed exactly how much you loved her. Called their bluff, didn't you? You always were willing to gamble with other people's lives, weren't you, Durzo? You coward.
You don't have any right! You would have given it all up for love? Horseshit! Where's the man in your life now, Gwyn? You don't whore anymore, so there's nothing for a man to be jealous of, right? But there's still no man, is there? Do you want to know why you're the perfect whore? For the same reason there's no man. Because you don't have the capacity for love. You're all cunt! You suck everyone dry and make them pay you for the pleasure. So don't give me that bleeding heart I did it to save my sister horseshit. It's always been power for you. Oh sure, there are women who whore for money or for fame, or because they don't have any other options. But then there are whores. You might not fuck anymore, Gwyn, but you will always be a whore. Now, what is her name?
Yulisandra. She lives with a nurse in the castle.
Mama Kay looked at the beer she was holding in her hand. She didn't even remember filling it. Was this what Durzo reduced her to? A submissive little... She didn't even know. She felt like she'd been eviscerated, that if she looked down, she'd see ropes of her own intestines coiled around her feet. It took all of her strength to spit in the beer and set it on the counter with even a shadow of nonchalance.
Well, it's tough to be a victim of circumstance.
You aren't... You wouldn't kill your own child!
I won't have to. They'll kill her for me.
Durzo picked up the beer, smiled at Guinevere over the spit, and drank it.
I'm leaving. It smells like old whore in here.
Kyla woke 2 hours before dawn and briefly wondered if death would be too high a price to pay for a full night's sleep. The correct answer, however, was unavoidable, so after a few minutes he dragged himself out of bed. He dressed quietly in the dark, reaching into his third drawer where his wet boy greys were folded as always, and reaching into his ash jar to smear his features black. In the past 9 years, he'd learned to compensate for not having the talent. When Blint was in an optimistic mood, which was increasingly rare, he praised Kyla for it. He said that too many wet boys relied on their talent for everything, and that he kept his mundane talents honed for unpredictable situations. In the bitter business, unpredictable situations were the norm.
Besides, if there's almost no noise of a footstep to cover in the first place, you don't have to use much of your talent to muffle it.
Sometimes Kyla's adaptability showed itself in more spectacular ways, but mostly it was in these little things, like putting his greys in the same dresser, the same way every time he washed them. At least, he hoped it was his adaptability and not Blint's mania for organization infecting him.
Seriously? What is it with the man's locking locks 3 times and spinning knives and the garlic and the night angel this and the night angel that?
Kyler opened the window and crept across the roof. Years of practice taught him where he could walk and where he had to crawl to be unheard by those below. He slipped over the edge of the house, dropped down to the flagstones in the courtyard, and vaulted off a rock to grab the edge of the wall. Kyler raised himself to peek over the edge, saw no one, pulled himself over the wall, and then moved stealthily up the street. He probably could have just walked. Sneaking wasn't really necessary once he got out of the sight of the Drake's home, and until he got within sight of the herbiary. But it was a bad habit to get into.
A job is a job. It isn't done till it's done.
Tonight, it wasn't just Blint's ingrained discipline that kept him creeping from shadows to shadow, making the 2-mile walk to the herbiary take almost an hour. Tonight, Charles' words kept going through his head.
You have enemies. You have enemies.
Maybe it was time he moved out of the Drake's house, for their safety. He was 20 years old, and though of course he didn't have the income of a noble, Blint was more than generous with his wages. In fact, Blint didn't really care about money. He didn't spend much on himself, aside from the infrequent binges on alcohol and rent girls. He did buy the best equipment and ingredients for poisons, but what he bought, he kept forever. With what he made for each kill and the frequency with which he took jobs, Blint had to be wealthy. Probably obscenely wealthy. Not that Kyler cared. He'd adopted much of Blint's attitude. He gave Count Drake a portion of his wages for a lien, and still had plenty left over. He kept some in coins and jewels, and split the rest between investments Mama Kay and Logan made for him. It meant nothing to him because money couldn't buy him anything. His cover as a poor country noble and his real work as a journeyman wet boy kept him from living a lifestyle that would attract attention, so even if he had wanted to spend his money, he couldn't afford to. He could move out, though. Rent a small home further south on the east side at the edges of one of the less fashionable neighborhoods. Blint had told him that if you bought the cheapest house in a neighborhood, no matter how expensive the neighborhood, you were invisible. Even if your neighbors noticed you, they'd take pains not to notice you. Kyler then was at the shop. The Sakage had long had an arrangement with herbalists in the city. The herbalists made sure they kept certain plants on hand that weren't strictly legal, and the Sakage made sure that the herbalist shops were never burglarized. The Crown knew about it, but was powerless to stop it. Goodman Aelyup's herbiary was frequented by rich merchants and the nobility, so he had refused to keep illicit herbs openly in his shop, fearing that such defiance in the very face of authority might not be ignored. He'd been able to refuse the Sakage, but no one refused Master Blint. Goodman Aelyup supplied Durzo with the rarest herbs. In return, Master Blint made sure no one else in the Sakage so much as went near his shop. It fell to Kyler to gather the necessaries and drop off the money, which he was doing tonight. The benefit to running these errands wasn't only that he learned the trade or that he established relationships with the people who would supply him in the future. It was also so that he could build his own collection. An elaborate collection like Master Blint's took years and thousands or even tens of thousands of gunders to build. The bad part was losing sleep. It didn't do for a young noble to sleep until noon unless he'd been out carousing with his friends. So even though he wouldn't get home until almost dawn, Kyler would have to wake with the sun. He grumbled silently, remembering a time when sneaking through the streets of Scenario at night had been fun. The back door of the shop, as always, was locked. Goodman Aelyup kept good locks on his doors, too. Though he'd never met him, they only wrote notes. Kyler felt he knew Goodman Aelyup, and the man was a strange one. With Durzo Blint's protection in the Sakage, the man could have safely left his doors wide open. No one in the city would dare steal from him.
A man's greatest treasures are his illusions.
For all the man claimed to hate teaching, he seemed to have an aphorism for every occasion. Kyler selected the proper pick and anchor from the kit on the inside of his belt, and he knelt in front of the door and started working. It was a new lock, and from Master Procles, the best locksmith in the city. New locks, even if they weren't high quality, always tended to be tighter, and if losing an anchor wasn't the end of the world, it was still irritating to break one. Kyler raked the pick over the pins. 4 pins, 2 of them a little loose. That meant it was the work of one of Procles' journeymen, and not the master himself. In 10 seconds, he turned the anchor, bending it.
Damn!
Kyler then tucked his tools away. Someday he was going to have to commission a set of Mistral picks and anchors like Master Blint had. Or at least one anchor. Mistral would flex, but never break. It was more expensive by weight than diamonds. Goodman Aelyup's claim that his business was an herbiary wasn't an idle boast. It had 3 rooms. The large, comfortable shop with labeled glass jars for the display of herbs, a tiny office, and the herbiary in which Kyler stood. The little room was humid, and the wet, fecund odors were almost overwhelming. Checking on the progress of some fungi, Kyler was pleased. Several lethal mushrooms would be ready within a week. Mushrooms were one kind of plant Goodman Aelyup could grow with impunity in his shop. Legal varieties were indistinguishable from edible mushrooms to anyone except trained herbalists and, of course, trained poisoners. Treading carefully so he didn't step on any of the boards that creaked, Kyler moved through the rest of the herbiary, judging the plants with a practiced eye. Kyla lifted the third plant box in the second row and saw 6 bundles carefully packed in individual lambskin pouches. He lifted them out and checked that each was what he had ordered. 4 bundles for Master Blint and 2 for himself. Kyla put the herbs in the pack, secured flush against his back under his cloak, and put the purse with Elyep's money into the little space. He set the planter back in position. Then, something felt wrong. In the blink of an eye, Kyla drew 2 short swords, but he didn't move a step. The feeling of wrongness continued, not something wrong of itself, but just something here and now and close. There was no sound. There was no attack. Just a slight pressure as of the softest possible touch of a finger. Kyla focused on the sensation even as his eyes scanned the shop and his ears strained to hear the slightest sound. It was like a touch, but it was pressing past him, toward... The lock on the back door clicked home. He was trapped. Restraining an impulse to run to the door and fling it open, Kyla stayed utterly still. No one was in the room with him. Of that he was certain. But he thought, yes, he could hear someone breathing in the shop. Then he realized that it was more than one person. One was breathing quickly, shallowly, excited. The other was breathing lightly, but slowly. Not tense, not excited. That scared Kyla.
Who could ambush a wet boy and not even be nervous?
Afraid of losing all initiative, Kyla moved slowly toward the wall that separated the herbiary from the shop. If he was right, one of the men was standing just on the other side of it, sheathing a short sword. Kyla then drew out the Karen hand-and-a-half sword he carried in a back scabbard. He brought the tip of the blade close to the wall and waited for the slightest sound. There was nothing. Now he couldn't even hear the excited man breathing. That meant the excited one must be on the other side of this wall, while the calm man was further. Kyla waited. He trembled with anticipation. One of the men on the other side of the entry was a witch.
Are they with the Caledorans Joel warned me about?
Kyla pushed the thought out of his head. He could worry about that later. Whoever they were, they had trapped him. Whether they thought he was Master Blint or just a common thief didn't matter. But which one was the witch? The nervous one? He wouldn't have thought so, but the feeling that had pressed past him and had locked the door had seemed to come from that side.
Back!
Kyla rammed his sword through the finger-thick pine. He yanked the sword back as he charged through the entryway. He burst through the curtain and launched himself off the doorpost and over the sales counter toward the man he tried to stab. The man was on the ground, rolling over as Kyla took a slice at his head. He was huge, bigger than even Logan, but proportioned like a tree trunk, thick everywhere with no definable waist or neck. For all that, even on his back, he was bringing up a sword to block Kyla's blow. He would have blocked it too if Kyla's sword had been whole, but half of Kyla's Karen blade was lying on the ground by the man, sheared off with magic a moment after he had rammed it through the wall. Finding no sword where he expected it, the big man's parry went wide as Kyla attacked from his knees. Without the full weight of the blade, Kyla brought the half-sword down faster than the big man could react and stabbed for his stomach. Suddenly, Kyla was hit with a massive concussion force. It blew him sideways through one shelf of herb jars and into a second. Then there was nothing but the light flashing in front of Kyla's eyes. His sword was gone. He blinked, vision slowly returning. His face down on the floor with a shattered shelf lying amid the remnants of broken jars and scattered herbs. Kyla kept still, not having to fake much to appear incapacitated. A few inches from his nose, he was slowly able to make out some of the plants. Pronley seed, ootbill bud, yarrow root. This shelf should have... And there it was, near his hand, delicate tuntun seed ground to a powder. If you breathed it, it would make your lungs hemorrhage. The footsteps came closer, and Kyla lurched, spinning to one side and flinging tuntun powder in an arc. Kyla came to his feet and drew a pair of long knives.
Enough, Shadow Strider!
Air congealed around Kyla like a jelly. He tried to dive away, but the jelly became as hard as rock. The two men regarded Kyla through the cloud of tuntun seed hanging frozen in the air. The blonde mountain folded meat slab arms across his chest.
Don't tell me you expected this, Dorian.
His friend grinned.
Not much to look at, is he?
The smaller man, Dorian, wore a short black beard under intense blue eyes, had a sharp nose, and straight white teeth. He reached forward and took some of the floating Tun-Tun powder between two fingers. Black hair, lightly oiled, blue eyes, pale skin. Definitely Caladoran. He was a witch.
Don't be a sore loser, Fear. Things would have gone badly for you if I hadn't broken his sword.
I think I could hold my own.
Actually, if I hadn't intervened, right now he'd be wondering how he was going to move such a large corpse. And that was without his talent.
The smaller man waved a hand and the Tun-Tun powder fell to the ground in a tidy pile. He looked at Kyler and the bonds holding him shifted, forcing him to stand upright with his hands down at his sides, though still holding the knives.
Is that more comfortable?
He touched Kyler's hand with a single finger and stared into him as if his eyes were cutting him open.
Look at this.
Fear accepted the hand Dorian put on his shoulder and stared at Kyler the same way. Kyler stood there not knowing what to say or do, his mind filled with questions that he wasn't sure he should give voice to.
Where's his conduit? It almost seems shaped like there's a niche for... By the light, he ought to be...
Terrifying, yes. He's a born Kakarifer. But that's not what worries me. Look at this.
Kyler felt something twist in him. He felt as if he were being turned inside out. Whatever he was seeing, it scared Fear. His face was still, but Kyler could almost feel the sudden tension in his muscles, the slight tang of fear in the air.
There's something here that resists me. The stream's winning. The shadow cloak makes it worse.
Let it go. Stay away from me.
Kyler felt whatever had been pulling him open drop away, though his body was still bound in place. Dorian rocked back on his heels, and Fear grabbed his shoulders in meaty hands and held him up.
What did you call me? Who are you?
Dorian smirked, regaining his balance as if by the force of good humor alone.
You ask who we are, wearer of names? It's Kyler now, isn't it? Old Jaren Punning. I like that. Was that your sense of humor, or Blint's?
Kyler wore a startled look on his face.
Blint's, apparently.
Dorian looked through Kyler again as if there were a list inside him that he was reading.
The Nameless. Maratai. Sweller. Spix. Kyler. Even Kage. Not terribly original, that.
What?
This was ridiculous. Who were these men?
Sakage means Lords of the Shadow. Thus Kage means Shadow. But I don't suppose that one's your fault. In any case, you ought to be more curious. Did it never occur to you to wonder why your peers had common names like Jarl or Bim, or slave names like Doll Girl or Rat, and you were burdened with Azoth?
Kyler went cold. He'd heard that witches could read minds, but he'd never believed it. And those names. That wasn't a random list.
You're witches! Both of you!
Fear and Dorian looked at each other.
Half right.
A little less than half, really.
But I was a witch, or more properly, a Meister. If you ever have the misfortune of meeting one, you may not want to use a slur.
What are you?
Friends, we've made a long journey to help you. Well, not only to help you, but to help you and...
And we've come at great personal cost and greater risk.
We hope you have no doubt that we could kill you. That if we wished you harm, we could have already done it.
There are more types of harm than just killing. A wet boy knows that.
Dorian smiled, but Fear still looked wary. Kyler felt the bonds release him. That unnerved him. They'd seen how fast he could move, and yet they released him, armed.
Allow me to introduce us. This is Fir Kusat, one day to be the most renowned swordsmith in all Midkiru. He is Vaisana and the blade master of the second echelon.
Great. And you?
You won't believe me.
Try me.
I am Sasurin and Hathsalar, and once a Wordmeister of the 12th Shura.
Impressive.
What should be more important to you is that I'm a prophet. My name is Dorian. Dorian Ursul.
You were right. He doesn't believe you.
Aside from carelessness, the only things that could kill wet boys were the wet boys, mages, and witches. In Blint's estimation, witches were the worst. He hadn't neglected Kyler's education.
Let me see your arms.
Ah, so you know about the Veer. How much do you know about them?
Dorian bared his arms to the elbows. There were no marks on them.
I know that all witches have them, that they grow in proportion to the witch's power, and their intricacy shows the witch's level of mastery.
Don't do it, Dorian. I'm not going to lose you over this. Let's tell him the words and get the hell out of here.
Only men and women who are talented can use the Veer. It's easier to manipulate than a talent and more powerful. It's also terribly addictive. And if one dare speak in moral absolutes, which I do, it's evil. Unlike the talent, which can be good or bad, like any talent, it is in itself evil, and it corrupts those who use it. It has proven useful to my family to have all Meisters marked, so they are. My ancestors never saw any reason to be marked ourselves unless we chose so. The Ursuls can make their Veer disappear at will, so long as they aren't using it.
Blint must have skipped that lesson.
A pity it is, too. We're the most dangerous Wordmeisters you could possibly imagine.
Dorian, just tell him the words.
Here, silence! You know what to do.
The big man obeyed, glowering at Kyler.
Kylar, you're asking a drunkard who's quit drinking to take just one glass of wine. I'll live in misery for weeks for this. Fear will have to watch me constantly to see that I don't slip away to that madness. But you're worth it.
Dorian held his arms out, and a shimmer passed over them. As Kyler stared at them, it looked as if veins deep in the man's arms were wriggling, struggling to get to the surface of his skin. Then, rapidly, they rose all together. Dorian's arms turned black like a million fresh tattoos were being inked over each other. Layer knotted on layer, each distinct, interlocking with those below and above, darker over lighter with darker still coming in above. It was beautiful and terrible. The Veer swelled with power and moved, not just with Dorian's arms, but independently. It seemed that they wanted to burst free of the confines of his skin. The darkness of the Veer spread to the room, and Kyler was sure it wasn't his imagination. The Veer was sucking the light from the room. Dorian's eyes dilated until the cool blue irises with tiny rims. A fierce joy rose in his face, and he looked 10 years younger. The Veer started to swell. Fear picked up Dorian like most men pick up a doll and shook him violently. He shook and didn't stop shaking. It would have been comical if Kyler weren't too scared to move. Fear just shook and shook until the room was no longer dark with power. Then he set Dorian down in a chair. The man abruptly looked frail and older once more. He spoke without raising his head.
I'm glad you're convinced, Shadow Strider.
It had convinced him, but Dorian couldn't know that.
How do I know it wasn't an illusion?
Illusions don't suck light. Illusions...
He's just being stubborn, Fear. He believes. I can't even look at you now. All your futures.
What do you want from me?
I can see the future, nameless one. But I am only human. So I pray that I can be wrong. I pray that I am wrong. By everything I've seen, if you don't kill Durzo Blint tomorrow, Kalidor will take Senaria. If you don't kill him by the day after that, everyone you love will die. Your Sekage Count, the Shinge, your friends old and new, all of them. If you do the right thing once, it will cost you a year of guilt. If you do the right thing twice, it will cost you your life.
So that's what this is? All this is just a setup so I'll betray Master Blint? Did your masters think I would buy it? Oh, you learned a lot about me. Must have cost a fortune to buy all that information.
Dorian held up a weary hand.
I don't ask you to believe it all now. It's too much all at once. I'm sorry for that. You think now that we're Caladorans, and we want you to betray Blint so that he can't stop us. Maybe this will convince you that you're wrong. What I beg of you above all else is that you kill my brother. Don't let him get the Karkari.
Kyler felt as if he'd just been stung.
The what?
Dorian, say the words we came to say.
Ask Mama Kay.
Wait, what? Ask her about the Kakari?
Ask Mama Kay.
What about your brother? Who is he?
If I tell you now, you'll lose when you fight him.
Dorian shook his head, but still didn't look at Kyler.
Damn this power. What good is it if I can't tell you in a way you'll understand? Kyler, if time is a river, most people live submerged. Some rise to the surface and can guess what's going to happen next, or can understand the past. I'm different. When I don't concentrate, I detach from the flow of time. My consciousness floats above the river. I see 1,000 paths. Ask me where a leaf will fall, and I couldn't tell you. There are too many possibilities. There's so much noise, like I'm trying to follow a drop of rain from the clouds to a lake, then over a waterfall, and I pick it out in the river 2 leagues downstream. If I can touch someone or chant rhymes, it gives me focus. Sometimes.
Dorian seemed to be looking through the wall, lost in reverie.
Sometimes when I transcend the river, I start to see a pattern. Then it's like water. It's fabric made up of every insignificant decision of every peasant as much as it is of great decisions by kings. As I begin to comprehend the vastness and intricacy of that skein, my mind starts to pull apart.
Dorian blinked and he turned his eyes to Kyler. He squinted as if even looking at him caused him pain.
Sometimes it's merely images totally unbidden. I can see the anguish on the young man's face who will watch me die. But I don't know who he is, or when that will be, or why he'll care. I know that tomorrow a square vase will give you hope. I see a little girl crying over your body. She's trying to pull you away, but you're too heavy. Away from what? I don't know.
A girl? When?
Was it Elena Drake?
I can't tell. Go now. Ask Mama Kay.
Fear threw open the front door. Kyler stared from one mage to the other, stunned at the abruptness of his dismissal.
Go! Go!
Kyler ran into the night. For a long moment, fear stared after him.
What didn't you tell him?
He's going to die. No matter what.
How does that fit?
I don't know. Maybe he's not what we hoped.
Kyler ran, but doubt ran faster. The sky was lightening in the east and the city was showing its first signs of life. The odds of running into a patrol were small, especially because Kyler knew better than to run on the roads past the rich shops that somehow saw patrols more frequently than roads with poor shops. But if he did run into guards, what would he say? I was just out for a morning walk with dark gray clothes, illegal plants, a small arsenal, and my face smudged with ash. He slowed to a walk. Mama Kay's wasn't far now, anyway. What was he doing, obeying a madman and a giant? He could almost see the beer rising from Dorian's arms, and it turned his stomach. Maybe not a madman, but what was their peace? The only people Kyler knew who did things just because they should were the Drakes, and he figured that they were the exception to the rule. In the Sakage, in the court, in the real world, people did what was best for themselves. Fear and Dorian hadn't denied that they had other motives for coming to Scenaria, but they certainly acted like he was the most important thing. They acted like they really believed he would change the course of the kingdom. It was madness, but he had believed them. If they were just liars, wouldn't they try to tell him how great things would be if he killed Blint? Or were they just that much cleverer than most liars? It seemed that by what Dorian had said that Kyler was going to lose everything, no matter what he did.
What kind of fortune teller tells you that?
Still, Kyler found himself jogging again, and then running. startling a laundress filling her buckets with water. He stopped at Mama Kay's door and suddenly felt uneasy again. Mama Kay stayed up late and woke early every day, but if there was one time of the day that he could be sure she'd be in bed, it was right now. It was the only time of day that the door would be locked.
Damn it, would you just make a decision?
Mama Kay's maid looked almost as surprised as Kyler was. She was an old woman wearing a shift with a shawl around her shoulders.
Well, good morning, my lord. If you want a sight. Oh, I couldn't sleep. I just kept thinking that we'd run out of flour for some reason, though I checked it just last night for some reason. I couldn't get it out of my mind that it was all gone. I was just walking past the door to check it when you knocked. Oh, by the 12 nipples of Erixula, I'm chattering like an old daft ninny.
Kyler opened his mouth, but a word wouldn't fit in the cracks of the ex-prostitute's rambling edgewise.
Time for a swift blow to the head and heave into the river, mistress, I tell her, and she just laughs at me. I do wish I were young, if only so I could see the look on your face like I used to get. Once these old sacks would make men stand up and take notice. You'd walk right smuck into a wall because you couldn't take your eyes off. It used to be that the sight of me in my night clothes... Of course, I didn't wear old lady rags like this, neither. But if I wore the kind of stuff I used to, I'm afraid I'd scare the little children. It does make me miss the good...
Is Mama Kay awake?
What? Oh, actually, I think so. She hadn't been sleeping well, poor lass. Maybe a visit will do her good. Though I think it was a visit from that Durzo that's got her knickers in such a bunch. It's hard at her age, going from what she's been to being like me. Almost 50 years old she is. It
Kyler edged past her and walked up the stairs. He wasn't even sure the old woman noticed. He walked up to Mama Kay's door. No response. A sliver of light peeked through the crack along the sill, though. Mama Kay sat with her back to him. 2 candles burned almost to nubs provided the only illumination in the room. She barely stirred when Kyler came in. Finally, she turned slowly toward him. Her eyes were swollen and red, as if she'd been up all night crying.
Crying? Mama Kay? Mama Kay, you look like hell.
You always did know just the thing to say to the ladies.
It was then he noticed the mirrors. Mama Kay's bedroom mirror where she put on makeup, her hand mirror, even her full-length mirror, every one of them was smashed. Shards twinkled feebly from the floor in the candlelight.
Mama Kay, what's going on here?
Don't call me that. Don't ever call me that again.
What's going on?
Lies, Kyler. Beautiful lies. Lies I've worn so long I don't remember what's beneath them.
Mama Kay turned. In a line down the middle of her face, she'd wiped off all her makeup. The left half of her face was free of cosmetics for the first time Kyler had ever seen. It made her look old and haggard. Fine wrinkles danced across the once delicate, now merely small and hard planes of Guinevere Carina's face. Dark circles under her eyes gave her a ghostly vulnerability. The effect of half of her face being perfectly presented and the other stripped was ludicrous, ugly, almost comic. Kyler covered his shock too slowly. Not that he could ever hide much from her, but Mama Kay seemed satisfied to be wounded.
I'll assume you're not here just to stare at the sideshow freak. So what do you want, Kyler?
You're not a sideshow.
Answer the question. I know what a man with a mission looks like. You're here for my help. What do you need?
Mama Kay, damn it, quit!
No, damn you! It's too late. Damn him, but he was right. I chose this life, Kyler. I've chosen every step. It's no good switching whores in the middle of a tumble. You're here about Durzo, aren't you?
He said he's going to kill me if I don't find the silver Kakari. I don't really even know what it is.
Oh, I've been trying to get him to tell you for years. 6 Kakari were made for Jorzan Alkesti's 6 champions. The people who used the Kakari weren't mages, but the Kakari gave them mage-like powers. Not like the feeble mages of today, either. The mages of 7 centuries ago. You are what they were. You're a Kakarifer. You were born with the hole in your talent that only a Kakari can bridge.
Mama Kay and Durzo had known all of this, and they hadn't thought to tell him?
Oh, well, thanks. Can you direct me to the nearest magical artifact store? Perhaps one with a discount for wet boys? Even if there were such things, they've either been collected by the mages or they're at the bottom of the ocean or something.
Or something.
Are you saying you know where the silver is?
Oh, consider this. You're a king. You managed to get a Kakari, but you can't use it. Maybe you don't have anyone you trust who can. What do? You keep it for a rainy day or for your heirs. Maybe you never write down what it is because you know that people will go through your things when you die and steal your most valuable possession. So you plan to tell your son someday before he takes the throne. In some way or another, though, as kings so often do, you get yourself killed before you can have that talk. What happens to the Kakari?
The son gets it.
Right, and doesn't know what it is. Maybe even knows it's important, that it's magical. But like you said, if he ever tells the mages, they'll take it from him or from his heirs sooner or later. So he keeps it, and keeps it secret. After enough generations pass, it becomes just another jewel in the royal treasury. By the time 700 years go by, it's switched hands dozens of times, but no one has a clue what it is. Until one day, Kalidor's God King demands a tribute that includes one particular jewel, and a remarkably stupid king gives the very same jewel to his mistress.
You mean...
I just found out today that Nina gave Lady Jadwin the silver Kakari, the Globe of Edges. It looks like a small, oddly metallic jewel, like a diamond with a silver tint to it. It also happens to be one of Queen Nelia's favorite jewels. She thinks it's lost, and she's furious. So tomorrow night, someone the king trusts, I don't know who, will be sent to get it back. The Jadwins are having a party that night. So tomorrow, the Kakari will be exposed. No royal guards, no mages, no magically warded treasury. Lady Jadwin will either be carrying it, or it will be in her room. Kyler, you need to understand what's at stake. The Kakari supposedly choose their own masters, but the Kalidorans believe they can magically force a bond. If the God King succeeds, imagine the havoc a God King would wreak if he could live forever.
It made prickles go up the back of Kyler's scalp.
You really mean this, don't you? Have you told Durzo?
Durzo and I'm not too inclined to help Durzo just now. But there's more, Kyler. I'm not the only one who knows this.
What do you mean?
Kalidor has hired someone to get it. That's how my spies found out in the first place. Supposedly, the job is a smash and dash.
Supposedly?
They've hired Hugh Gibbet.
Nobody would hire Hugh for a smash and dash. The man's a butcher.
I know.
Then who's his debtor?
Take your pick. Half the nobles in the realm will be there. Your friend Logan has accepted his invitation. Perhaps even the prince will be there. Those two do seem to be inseparable, for all that they are night and day to each other.
Mama, who's your spy? Can you get me an invitation?
My spy can't help you, but I know someone who can. In fact, despite my best efforts, you know her too.
Kyler had walked up to men in broad daylight within paces of the city guard to kill them. He'd crawled under tables while a cat clawed him as guards searched the room for intruders. He'd had to break into a vat of wine and hide inside it as a noble wine taster had picked out an appropriate bottle for dinner. He'd waited a yard from a fully stoked oven after he'd poisoned a stew while a cook debated with himself on what spice he'd added too much of to make it taste so strange. But he'd never been this nervous. He stared at the door, a narrow servant's entrance, in dismay. He was a beggar today, come to beg a crust. His hair was lank and greasy, smeared with ash and tallow. His skin was tough and brown, hands gnarled and arthritic. To get to that door, he had to make it through the guards at the estate's tall gate.
Oi, old man, what you been wanting?
I heard my little girl is here. Miss Cromwell? I hope she might find me a crust is all.
That woke up the other guard, who had only given Kyler a cursory glance.
What'd you say? You're related to Miss Cromwell?
The protective air around the man, who must have been nearly 40, was palpable.
No, she's not mine. Just an old friend.
The guards looked at each other.
You want to go find her and bring her out here at this time of day with the goings-on tonight?
The other shook his head and started patting Kyler down gingerly.
Swear I'll get lice off of one of Miss Cromwell's strays one of these days.
Yeah, I know it, but she's worth it, isn't she?
You're not so magnanimous when you're the one patting down the beggar's butt.
Ah, stuff it.
Go on, kitchen's that way. But I'm lenient with you, but if you tell me to stuff it one more time, I'll show you the business into my boot.
Kyler shuffled to the kitchen, favoring a stiff knee. The guards, for all their talk, were professionals. They held their weapons like they knew what to do with them, and though they hadn't seen through his disguise, they hadn't neglected their duty to search him. Such discipline boded ill for him. Though he took his time walking and memorizing the layout of the estate grounds, the walk wasn't nearly long enough. The Jadwins had been dukes for 5 generations, and the manse was one of the most beautiful in the city. The Jadwin estate overlooked the Plyth River and directly faced Cennaria Castle. Just north of the estate was East Kingsbridge, which was ostensibly for military use, but it was rumored to be used more often for the king's nocturnal liaisons. If Lady Jadwin really was the king's mistress, the Jadwin estate was perfectly placed for easy access. The king also kept the Duke running all over Mid-Kiru on diplomatic missions that everyone but the Duke knew were pure pretense. The manse itself was set on a small central hill that allowed it to look over the river, despite 12-foot spiked walls that bordered the entire property. With a trembling hand, he masked as a palsy, Kyler knocked at the servant's entrance.
Yes?
A young woman stood in the open doorway, wiping her hands on an apron and looking at Kyler expectantly. She was a beautiful woman, maybe 17, with an hourglass figure that even through a servant's woolens obviously would have been the envy of any of Mama Kay's rent girls. The scars were still there, an X on her cheek, an X across her full lips, and a loop from the corner of her mouth to the outside of her eye. The scar gave her a permanent little grin, but the kindness of her mouth eased the cruelty of the scar. Kyler remembered how her eye had looked, swollen grossly. He'd been afraid she would never see out of it. But her eyes, both of them, were clear and bright brown, sparkling with goodness and happiness. Doll Girl's nose had been broken to mush, and Aline's wasn't completely straight, but it didn't look bad. And she had all her teeth. Of course, he realized. She'd been young enough that she'd only lost small teeth in the beating.
Come in, Grandfather. I'll find you something to eat.
The girl offered her arm and didn't seem offended by his staring. She took him to a small side room with a narrow table for the servants who needed to be within earshot of the kitchen.
Can I get a salve for your hands? I know it's painful on these chilly mornings.
What had he done to deserve this? He'd come as the most foul sort of beggar, and she showered him with kindness. He had nothing to give her, yet she treated him like a human being. This was the woman who had almost died because of his arrogance and stupidity, his failure. The only ugliness in her life was because of Kyler. He'd thought he'd set aside his guilt 2 years ago when Mama Kay had told him the simple truth that he'd saved Aline from worse than scars. But looking at those scars up close threatened to throw him right back to that hell. She put a crust covered with fresh hot gravy down on the table and started to cut it into smaller pieces.
Would you like to sit here? We'll just make this a little easier for you to chew, yes?
Aline smiled and the scars tugged at her full lips. No. He'd put her here, with these people who adored her, where she could afford to share a crust. Aline had made her own choices to become who she was, but he had made those choices possible. If there was one good thing he'd done, it was this. He closed his eyes. When he opened his eyes and looked at her without guilt darkening his vision, she was stunning. Aline's hair was lustrous gold. Aside from the scars, her skin was flawless, eyes large and bright, cheekbones high, lips full, teeth white, neck slender, figure entrancing.
Do you know who I am?
Aline Cromwell looked at him strangely, uncomprehending. He wanted to stay hunched, to hide from those gentle eyes, but he couldn't. He straightened his back and stood up and stretched his fingers.
Kyla? It is you! What are you doing here? Did Max and Elena send you? Oh my god, what did they tell you?
Forget Kyla. Look at me and tell me who you see.
An old man? It is a very good costume, but it isn't a costume party.
Look at me, doll girl.
Aline stopped, transfixed, peering into his eyes. She touched his face. Her eyes went wide.
Azoth! Oh!
She flung herself at him so fast, he almost tried to block her attack. Then she was squeezing him. He stood stock still, his mind refusing to understand for a long moment. She was hugging him. He couldn't make himself move, couldn't think. He simply felt. The smooth skin of her cheek brushed his scruffy, unshaven one. Her hair filled his nostrils with a clean scent of youth and promise. She hugged him fiercely, the notes of strong, hard arms joining with supple, firm stomach, and back joining with the pure feminine softness of her chest, pressed against his, making a chord of perfect acceptance. Tentatively, he lifted his hands from his sides and touched her back. He tasted salt on his lips, a tear, his tear. His chest convulsed uncontrollably. Kyla grabbed her, and she squeezed him harder still. The world was reduced to a single hug. Reunion, joy, acceptance.
Azoth, I heard you were dead.
You will always be alone.
Kyla froze up. If tears could stop halfway down a cheek, his would have. He released Aline deliberately, stepped back. Her eyes were red, but still shining as she dabbed her tears away with a handkerchief. A sudden desire to sweep her into his arms and kiss her crashed over him in a wave. He blinked, held himself still until reality could reassert itself. He opened his mouth, couldn't say a thing, couldn't ruin it. He tried again, ready to lay out his lies, couldn't.
Relationships are ropes. Love is a noose.
He gave me a chance. I could have been a Fletcher, an herbalist. I chose this. I was ordered never to see you again by my master, Durzo Blint.
Kyla couldn't even tell if Aline had heard of Durzo Blint. Her eyes tightened in confusion. He could see her working through it. If Durzo was his master, that meant... He saw a quick little disbelieving smile as if she were about to say,
But wet boys are monsters, and you're not a monster.
But then the smile faded. Why else would her Azoth never contact her? How else would a guild rat disappear so completely? Her eyes grew distant.
When I was hurt, I remember you arguing with someone, demanding that he save me. I thought it was a dream. That was Durzo Blint, wasn't it?
Yes.
And you? Now you're what he is?
Close enough.
You apprenticed with him so he would save me? You became what you are because of me?
Yes. No. I don't know. He gave me a chance to leave after I killed Rat, but I didn't want to be afraid anymore. And Durzo was never afraid. And even as an apprentice, he paid me so well that I could...
Her eyes narrowed as she puzzled it out.
That you could support me?
He nodded. What was he doing? He should be lying to her. The truth could only destroy.
I'm sorry. I shouldn't have told you.
You're sorry?
He knew what the next words out of her mouth would be.
You're a failure. Look what you've done to me. What are you talking about? You've given me everything. You fed me on the streets when I was too young to find food for myself. You saved me from Rat. You saved me when your master was going to let me die. You put me with a good family who loved me.
But aren't you mad at me?
Why would I be mad at you?
If I hadn't been so arrogant, that bastard wouldn't have come after you. I humiliated him. I should have been watching. I should have protected you better.
You were 11 years old.
Every scar on your face is my fault. Gods, look at you. You would have been the most beautiful woman in the city. Instead, you're here giving crusts to beggars.
Instead of where? Do you know any girls who've been prostitutes since they were children? I do. I've seen what you saved me from. And I'm grateful for it every day. I'm grateful for these scars.
But your face!
If this is the worst ugliness in my life, Azoth, I think I'm pretty lucky.
Aline smiled, and despite the scars, the room lit up. She was breathtaking.
You're beautiful.
Thank you.
Aline touched his arm. At her touch, shivers went through him.
I'm sorry for what you've had to pay to put me here. I don't even know what to think. Sometimes it seems the god's hand doesn't reach very far into the Warrens. I'm sorry.
Aline looked at him for a long time, and another tear tracked down her cheek. She ignored it, just absorbing him.
Are you a bad man, Kyla?
Yes.
I don't believe you. A bad man would have lied.
Maybe I'm an honest villain.
I think you're still the boy who shared his bread with his friends when he was starving.
I always took the biggest piece.
Then we remember differently. Are you here for work?
It was a shot in the solar plexus.
There's a wet boy coming to kill someone at the party tonight and steal something. I need an invitation to get in.
What are you going to do?
In truth, Kyler had barely thought about it.
I'm going to kill him.
And it was the truth. Hugh Gibbet was the kind of twist who started killing beggars when he had to go too long between jobs. He needed murder like a drunkard needs wine. If Kyler came and stole the Silva Kakari first, Hugh Gibbet would come after him. He was a full wet boy and reputed to be as strong of a fighter as Durzo. Kyler's only chance to kill him would be to catch him off guard. Tonight.
If you're a wet boy, you've got other ways to get in. You must know forgers. Kyler Stern must have contacts. Maybe an invitation from me would be the easiest way in, but that's not why you came. You came here to case the place, didn't you?
His silence was answer enough.
All these years, I thought Azoth was dead. And maybe he is. Maybe I helped kill him. I'm sorry, Kyla. I'd give my life to help you, but I can't give you what's not mine to give. My loyalty, my honor belongs to the god. I can't betray my lady's trust. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave.
It was a gentler banishment than he deserved, but banishment all the same. Kyler hunched and curled his fingers into arthritic claws and left. He turned once he reached the gate, but Aline wasn't even watching him go. Like all good ambushes, this one came at a time and place where they least expected it. Solon and Regnus and his men had made it down the mountains, over the central plains, and had come within 2 miles of Cenaria's sprawling northern edge. Duke Geir and his men were between 2 wide rice paddies on the raised road when they came upon a man leading a cart horse. Several peasants were working in the paddies, but they were dressed simply, trouser legs rolled up to their knees, obviously devoid of armor or weapons. The carter pulled his old horse to the side, looking at the men in armor intently. Solon should have noticed it earlier, of course. Peasants didn't wear long sleeves in the paddies, but it wasn't until he was within 20 paces of the carter that he saw it. The Verdmeister clapped his wrists together, and witchfire spurted forward. The witchfire hit the guard to Solon's left and went right through him. The magic was designed to melt off in layers like an icicle as it punched through each man. It was the size of a man's head as it went through the first man, then the size of a man's fist as it hit the second, then the size of a man's thumb as it hit the third. In an instant, all three were dead, flames roaring off their flesh, burning on the blood that spilled out of the men as if it were oil. A second later, witch-fire hit the guards from each side as a birdmeister on each side of the road hurled death into their midst. Another 3 men dropped. That left Solon, Duke Geyer, and 2 guards. It was a tribute to the men's discipline that they did anything at all, but Solon knew they were doomed. 1 guard rode right, Duke Geyer and the other guard rode left, leaving Solon to take care of the Verdmeister on the road. Solon didn't move. The Verdmeister had set their ambush so they'd have ample time to get off 2 or 3 balls of witchfire. 12 swordsmen were no match for 3 witches. There was no time to weigh the consequences. Not even time to draw the sunlight streaming onto the patties into magic. Solon drew directly on his Glora Virden and threw 3 tiny sparks through the air. They flew as fast as arrows and somehow avoided hitting the Duke or his guards. Both Verdmeisters were gathering green fire again as the sparks, each hardly as big as a fingertip, touched their skin. They weren't even close to lethal. Solon didn't have enough magic to face even 1 Verdmeister alone, much less all of them together. But the spark shocked them, a small shock, but enough to tense their muscles for a second and totally break their concentration. Before they could gather their wits, 3 swords descended with all the force of 3 galloping horses and 3 battle-hardened arms, and the 2 witches to either side of the road died. Solon threw the spark at the witch on the road last, and the man blocked it. Indeed, it wasn't so much blocking as merely snuffing. The spark flew toward him and then died as if it were a fiery twig being dropped in the ocean. His counterattack was a gush of fire that roared toward Solon. There was no blocking it. Solon flung himself from the saddle and threw another spark as he fell to the ground and rolled off the road. The witch didn't even bother to quench the spark as it flew a good 10 feet wide of him. The spark hit the cart horse's flank. The Verdmeister never even heard the horses whinny. He dropped on all 4s, not knowing anything but that something was terribly wrong. He turned to see the horse regain its balance. The horse and cart ran right over the man, crushing him into the road. Solon pulled himself out of the water and mud of the rice paddy as the cart horse ran as it must not have run in 10 years. His own horse was dead, of course, its skull a smoking ruin, and the smell of burnt hair and cooked meat mingling over its half-ruined corpse. The witch fire was barely smoldering on the bodies of the dead guards now. Even as he watched, it guttered out. Witch fire spread horribly fast, but only last about 10 seconds.
10 seconds? Has it only been that long?
Solon looked up at Duke Geyer, whose face was still and hard.
You're a mage.
Yes, my lord.
The lines were written now by Solon's silence. The Duke had no choice. Confronted with such a surprise, a more clever man would have pretended to have known Solon was a mage all along. Then he could have decided what to do with him later. Duke Geyer was too straightforward for that. It was his strength and his weakness.
And you've been reporting on me to other mages?
Only to friends, my lord.
It was weak. It had made him sound weak to say it, Solon knew, but he couldn't imagine that it could all disappear like this. Surely his friendship with Regnus, surely 10 years of service were worth more than this.
No, Solon. Loyal vassals don't spy on their lords. You've saved my life this day, but you've been betraying me for years. How could you?
It wasn't as...
For my life, I give you yours. Begone! Take one of the horses and go! If I ever see your face again, I'll kill you.
Stay with him. His life depends on it. A kingdom depends on it. By your word or silence, your brother king lies dead.
But Dorian had never said how long Solon had to serve his Lord Geyer, had he? Solon bowed low in front of his friend and took a bridle from Gurdon, who looked too stunned for emotion. Solon mounted and turned his back on Lord Geyer.
Did I save Sonaria today? Or doom it?